Okay, so over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you, JJ. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And thank you everyone for being here on session 4 of 6 of the Oklahoma Archivist Association series, Archiving 101. As JJ said, my name is Jennifer Green. I'm with the Oklahoma Department of Libraries and the State Archives. And today we're going to talk about arrangement and description. So I have a series of slides I'm going to show, and I have a couple of stopping points for questions midway. So really, please, let's engage and talk a little bit. This is a topic that's really broad, and I could probably talk about it for many, many hours, and having just one is difficult. So I won't take too long in the introduction, but to say, please jump in with questions. If you have anything while I'm speaking, just raise your hand and we'll call on you. So let's try and make this an interactive talk. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So today's outline, as I said, we'll go over some arrangement and description topics, starting with provenance and original order. I'm also going to address levels of arrangement. We'll talk about finding aids and also descriptive standards. So jumping right in, provenance is, as you can see, I'm not going to read off the definition there, but I like to put those. Those are from the SAA glossary of archival terms. And it really is all about chain of custody and context for knowing how these materials came to be in your possession, the source of the materials. It is a fundamental principle of archives, basically because it provides the context for the materials, the context in which the materials were created. And without that context, a lot of times it's more difficult to understand what the material means, what it's about, the greater significance of what that is evidence of. So having that provenance gives you a picture of the world in which these materials were created. It also gives you further evidence of proper custody, knowing that you have the rights as you were secured during accessioning, but that the donor also had those rights in which to bestow. So knowing how things came to be in your possession is very helpful for a lot of reasons. Also to establish that authenticity of what those materials are really what they're claiming to be, essentially. And original order, which I'm going to talk about some more, is the organization or sequence of the materials as they arrive in the repository. Hopefully there is one. To identify something, some original order is really about making observations and just taking a bird's eye view of what you have in the collection. I put a quote here from Theodore Schellenberg, one of the archival founding fathers, and this article from 1961, American Archivist, has a lot of language, very specific in some cases about what should and should not be done. Some ideas are still followed and others have kind of fallen away as processes have evolved. But I really like this quote because it is important to remember that sometimes you could get a box that's absolutely a mess and it just came off of someone's desk. Like if you've ever seen a very messy desk and all of that just got shoved into a box, well, it's unlikely that that mess is indicative of something. Possibly it is, and maybe you could record that and say, wow, this box was really a mess and I organized every document. But it's not something that is absolutely paramount in the lifespan of those documents if you can't identify one. So that is what this slide's all about as far as knowing when to make that call. And so imposing an order on something is a lot more work than going with the original order. So again, the process of processing, which is arrangement description, can be very in-depth, or it can be pretty straightforward and where you can go straight to description and rehousing if there's not a lot of arranging to do. So you really hope that you can find that original order in some documents when you get them in, or whatever these materials may be, so you can understand how they're organized and how to best describe them. Because that's really what the point of having a proper arrangement is, for access. And so when you look at something and see, okay, these documents are in order by project, or they're in order by some other element that the creator has designated, you can retain that arrangement, leave them as they are, have a lot less work to do, and then all you have to do is describe them. So that description is what we'll talk about a little bit later with the finding aid and the textual documents that you'll create to describe your materials. So typically, when you're talking about a single collection, there are 5 levels of arrangement, which we'll get to in just a moment. These are some examples of different types of organization that you may see in the documents. It could be that they came in this original order. A lot of times it will be the function of the item, because if you think about how you keep your records at home, there's probably a reason why you have certain things grouped together. You're going to want to look at them again or for a reason. You want to do your taxes or rectify your bank accounts, or look back over things that you purchased. So the purpose of the arrangement always comes back to access. And ease of description, also very helpful, so you can describe those things. You want to be able to group things and not have to describe everything individually. And so I did have a caveat here at the bottom about electronic records and things that are digitized, because when you're talking about single items versus groups of items, your description is going to vary based on that. So the 5 levels of arrangement are seen here. And this is based on a traditional paper-based collection, but it could be any type of material. This quote that I have here from Oliver Holmes, this is also another kind of a classic archives article from American Archivist in 1964, where he talks about arrangement, verifying that original order, kind of just going through the steps of saying, this is how you get from the accessioning room to the shelf. So this process of processing, you're going to go through each one of these levels and make that description if it's necessary. So the collection, as you observe and as you look deeper into the materials, will tell you how that treatment should come about. So you'll see if there are natural groupings of records that you can describe as a whole without having to break them down individually. You'll see if there's a logical order that you could impose as far as type of item, function, time span, those sorts of things. So when you're looking at a collection as a whole, many times you can notice certain groupings that will appear to you when you're looking at the whole thing. So there may be sections of that collection that are specific to a certain purpose or a certain function or an individual or a job or a project. Any of these things could be that common denominator, but there will be something that identifies them. This can be helpful in large collections, but it really isn't necessary if you have a small bunch of things. I'd say 1 to 10 boxes is what I would consider small as far as the size of a collection. Cubic foot boxes is what I'm thinking. So, and there's really no rule about making a series. You can make a series as small as 1 item or 2 items if you want to, but you're really just making more work for yourself. If there's a way you can roll that into a larger grouping, then that's really what you're looking to do at this point. So I put some examples of series here that you may see in personal papers. There's usually some correspondence, letters, and then there may be personal writings, diaries, and things. You could have other items they collected, recipes, newspaper clippings, other ephemera from their life. So these groupings, which may naturally be already housed together, would be something you could identify then as a series. And this makes it, again, easier to describe. And it also allows your researcher, who's the person, the element you should be thinking about this whole time is how's our end user going to access this material. It will help them understand what all is in that collection and how it relates to each other and the collection as a whole. So I kind of went through a bunch of stuff there, and I wanted to pause for a moment and see if anyone had questions or examples or things they wanted to ask about regarding provenance, original order, or levels of arrangement in a collection. Okay. So before you start processing, you're going to continue to look at this material before anything gets moved or refoldered or rehoused, so you know exactly what you're dealing with. And part of that is researching the creator, which could be a person, or it could be a business, or it could be an event, the thing that all of this material was created around. So you want to make sure that you understand the context of those things by researching, and that's generally just looking stuff up online and finding a reputable biography or other source of information about the individual or the business. A lot of times you can go even to the Secretary of State's website if you want to look for an incorporation date for a business or other things where you can really find, government documents that back up facts that you can then state in part of your scope note, your bio note. Other things will go into your finding aid. So researching the creator and the business is very important, but it's also, again, to observe the collection as a whole and really see from that high level what all you have in there, because that's going to dictate to you how you proceed with your processing plan. It's really best to take notes throughout this process and record citations for where you find that information about individuals. So you can make references to those things in the finding aid or on your website. If you're going to have an exhibit or do anything else with these materials, it's also nice to have references for where this background information came from, so you could go back to it again later if you need to do more in-depth research. So again, as a reminder to choose the most obvious path. Don't rearrange anything unless it's really, really necessary. If there's a way you can leave it as it is, that's the best plan, and to keep it simple. So part of that planning that you can do is actually to create a processing plan, which there are some templates for. You can search online and find some different examples of processing plans. You'd like to have some basic elements there, identifying the collection. Obviously, you want to make sure that that's clear of what you have, where it came from. If there are any access restrictions, so some of this information is going to carry over from your accession record that you can put right into that processing plan. That's important to note because you wouldn't want a lot of work to go into something that was restricted or confidential and would not be able to be released or used by the public. or unintentionally released. It's important to document your formats, the different types of material that may require different treatment as far as housing and preservation and description. So that way you can have a better idea of what materials you might need for supplies and also for making your description and your finding aid. And at this point, you could probably make your decision about how far you're going to go with your processing. So when you're describing a collection, it's up to you as the processor, as the archivist there, to look at it and say, you know, I feel like I can make a general description of this material to a certain level, and that will make it usable. And that's really the main goal, is how can I most easily and simply make this collection housed friendly in a preservation friendly way and also available for research. Because the longer it takes something to get processed, the more complicated and the more in-depth you start to make your description, the longer that material will be back in the back of the house and not available for public use. And that's really, as we all know, our purpose for existing is to get that material out there and have people use it. So you don't want things languishing in the back, and you don't want a project that's so difficult to maintain that if someone has to drop off and you need to replace that staff member or internship rolls over, that you can't have another person be able to pick right up on it. And that's also where processing plans can be helpful. Even if you're not ready to work that collection right away, you can make a processing plan and then file it with that accession paperwork or with the collection itself. So then when you have someone come in, say as a volunteer or a student, and they're looking for a project, you can have those processing plans ready to kind of look through and say, oh, okay, this one will fit within the time that you have for your internship or for your semester, or other, elements of that work time. So other than your formats, you're going to look at your preservation needs for housing and supplies, approximate time to process, so you kind of know what you're looking at. And these are things that you will really learn just through doing. It's really hard to estimate. A lot of times it could be wrong. You never know. Once again, it's sort of like doing renovations at home. You start taking something apart and then it gets more complicated and it may take longer. So, these things are approximate. Always have to be flexible. Good rule of thumb in archiving. And also, if you have already assigned, you can put the staff name of who's going to work this collection. So when you get ready to start giving the materials some description, it's important, again, to plan and decide how you're going to care for the collection as a whole. And so at this point, it's good to decide, you've made a decision on how far you're going to process this. Say, okay, I'm going to take this to a folder level description, or I'm going to take this to a box level description, or an item level. Those are probably the most common. And then you want to choose the data points that you're going to use for each level and make a template for that and stick with it so it's consistent throughout the collection and your finding aid. And at this point, there are consortiums that you can consider making your template after. So if you decide later you would like to upload those into something like Archive Grid, there's a number of other places that accept single items, Digital Public Library, and others where they require a template, sort of like a MARC record for a published item that includes a certain number of data elements. So that may be something that you want to research before you get started with your description template, just to have those things in place in the event that you want to submit your finding aids to a larger catalog where they can be exposed to more patrons. I put a link here to DAX, as it's commonly known, which is a Society of American Archivists publication. that was originally adopted, I think in the late aughts, I think 2007 or 8, and it's had a few different editions. There's a GitHub website where updates are made and all sorts of elements are discussed and changed. I really like to start with DAX as a format for understanding the different elements. It goes through each part of the finding aid, sort of like a style guide where it's going to give you a number, an alphanumeric section for each element. So you can go through and compare the types of description and decide which points you'd like to include. DAX offers minimum requirements for description, and then there's also optimal and I think advanced. There's 3 different levels where it's like, here's the basics of what you need. Here's something that's a little more robust. And then here's something that's going to have lots and lots of attention to detail and more specific information. And again, how you decide what type of treatment you're going to give materials is probably due to a number of factors, most importantly being your audience. So who are you making this description for, and who is going to want to use this material? If you're a very specialized archive and you have a very small scope of collecting, then you'll know exactly who those people are. If you're something like the State Archive and you're a government entity and you receive records because they are transferred to you on a schedule, then this is going to be less of a factor, and you'll probably have a more stringent or easy to come to template. But if you're in a public or a private archive and you've purchased a collection and it's very important and it was expensive, and maybe there's a donor that really wants to see that sparkly finding aid, then you can go the extra mile and make that, all of the data elements included. And so as much as you would want to have things in a consistent way, description, each collection is really going to be different. Again, it will dictate its own needs as far as that description. So again, you want to choose all of these elements before you get started. So then you don't find yourself midway saying, oh, I wish I had added a certain element when you've already described half the collection. So here's a good example. When I was at the city of Oklahoma City, we had a very large collection of construction plans and specifications to describe. And there were over 6,000 individual items. And this is not something that can be described in a larger general context. You could say, oh, we have all these plans about buildings. Well, that doesn't really help anyone who's looking for a specific building. So you have to have a number of data points. And so we went through and chose these data points, and myself being not well acquainted with construction plans and specifications, I failed to include a data point for the types of plan. So if it's mechanical, if it's structural, if it's electrical, and sometimes a set of plans would have all of those. Sometimes it would have 1, sometimes it would have 2 or 3, just depending on the type of project, if it was a remodel or if it was a complete build or all of these other elements. And so while we did keep the engineer and the architect and the dates and the address and all of these other data points, not having that specific element really wasted a lot of our time, because then someone would say, oh, I'd like to see this plans, and we'd pull them out and find, well, it's only electrical. It doesn't have the structural plans. It doesn't have the thing that they're looking for because we failed to include that data point. So you don't always know, but you want to try to make sure that you think about how those materials will be accessed, and then that's going to lead you to the things that you want to include. I included some links here for technical standards, conventions, rules, taxonomies. Those are different things. And I encourage you all to explore both of these websites. The one below is the Society of American Archivists Published Standards, which DAX is one of those. So there are certain standards that SAA has come up with and adopted as an organization that they endorse with publications and work of their staff, et cetera. And then the link above, the standards external, is a list of standards from outside entities, everywhere from the International Standard Organization, ISOs, to very specific and small taxonomies for art and architecture and cultural materials and all sorts of other things. So technical standards are they're templates. Like I've already mentioned the MARC record, which is used for publications to make that bibliographic record. Other technical standards are things like it's what fields they require for the description. And that is in the same vein as the template for a consortium. So the technical standard will dictate which data points you're recording and how you record them. Conventions and rules is more into the how you record them element. So it's kind of what I talked about in session 2 about how you name a collection, like papers versus collection versus, I can't even think of a third one. So you have the different ways you name something, and it's an indicative of what the material is. And so the way you describe it is the same process of saying, well, if you use the term letters, does that mean there's back and forth, which would actually be correspondence, or is it just one way? And there's different considerations that you want to make in your description that there's lots of guidance for in these documents. And a taxonomy is something that helps you explain what a thing is. So it will give you terms for formats, and it will give you terms for the makeup of the material. If you are dealing with an object or something that you need to describe the type of film or the type of photograph or the type of paper it's on, there are agreed upon terms to describe these different types of item. And that's what a taxonomy will help you determine. So a lot of these things can be consulted as needed. Some of them, the technical standards you probably want to look at and have a good idea of before you start processing. But the conventions and rules and taxonomies are things you can consult throughout processing and making those descriptions just based on the needs of the collection of what you're trying to describe. So once you start working on your finding aid, this is an example of the basic 8 elements that you will need to include. The top 3 check marks, you obviously want to have your collection information. That's everything about that collection. A lot of it, again, is going to be copied from the accession record. It will be the same information as. The administrative information is when did it come to your repository and how, and what have you done to it since it's been there, essentially. You can include things like the staff member who processed the collection. You can include the dates of processing. You can include, as much or as little administrative information as you'd like to have for public knowledge, because that's where this finding aid will end up. Again, it's important to decide on these things before you start making finding aids or before you start a project, so you can have consistency throughout. And if you're going to include processing notes and staff names and things like that on one, then it's nice to have them on as many as possible, or start that going forward. And then obviously you're going to have the container list inventory, which is the actual listing out of all the materials. So these other elements, you have the title, you have the unique ID, that's going to be your accession number most likely. The dates of the collection would be the date of the material was created, not when you got it in or what it's about. I've seen some finding aids that were misleading in that way, where they might put a date in that was the time that the material was discussing, or the subject of the material, and not necessarily the time it was created. And so you want to make sure that your creation date is what that is. And these types of elements are really well described in the describing archives content standard. That DAX document has, I think, like 6 or 7 different date elements that many I'd never considered until I went through and looked at them all and thought, oh yeah, there's a date for that. There's a date for a lot of things. Obviously, you want to include your creating entity, if that's individual or business. And then you want to have that context, the background for the individual or business. And as I said before, you're going to do some research on this. And so as you're going through, and if you see a biography or a historical article or something that is reputable and trustworthy, then you could absolutely take from that bio. You could link to it in your finding aid. You know, you're not required to recreate the wheel, and, you know, we're not all writers. And so, you know, writing a narrative history of something is not really what this is about. It's just to be sure and identify that person or that business against others who may have a similar or same name, which happens. Your scope and content note is about the collection itself. So that will describe what is there in entirety, and then a little more about exactly what is there and even what is not there. So there are times when you may receive a collection of someone who could be a notable local person, and they held a number of public offices or positions that were well known, and you could receive just a portion of those papers. So you might have materials from a certain time of their career or their life, but not another more notable or other time that people would be interested in. So if someone's looking at some particular part of history and they want to know all about the work that a certain individual did at a company, but it's not included in your collection, it's okay to say that in your scope note. It's preferable to say that, to say this does not include any material from their time at Boeing or whatever that might be, just to be absolutely clear and upfront about what it is you have. And this helps your researcher know, oh, okay, this is something I want to see, or it's not. And again, your container list and inventory, which you can include locations if that's the kind of finding aid that you want to have. Some do and some do not. I like to have them there because then when your patron's looking for boxes, they can give you that location code, and you don't necessarily even need the box number because you have the location, and having both is even better. Water. So this is an example of a finding aid from the Oklahoma Historical Society Research Archive, which you can tell from the top of the page there. I've also linked to the Purdue University Libraries and iSchool. They had a really cool annotated finding aid. So it includes all of the elements with notes about what each one is and does and why it's there. So I chose this as an example, the Alvin Rucker collection, because it has the basic elements. Something I had not included was a preferred citation. And that is also helpful for obviously students, authors, anyone who's using your collection will know how you would like that to be stated in their bibliography. And this gives the format. There in the middle, you see it has an indicator with an M and that accession number. It's the manuscript series, includes the date range 1856 to 34. So he was born in 1879, but apparently there's material in this collection from before the time of this person's birth. Maybe it's family letters. That's interesting to note. So you can see that he was a writer at the Oklahoman newspaper, And at the very end, there's a little descriptive part of the descriptive note that says the typed copies of stories are notated as original and clippings as clipping. So that's just a helpful note for whoever's looking at this finding aid to understand how you've made your description. And that's perfectly fine to go ahead and define those terms in something like that descriptive note. So while the biography discusses the individual, the descriptive note, which is the scope and content note, talks about the collection. So we can see that this individual went to Carleton College, but we don't necessarily know that any of this material is from that time. It doesn't say if it is or isn't, but it doesn't really focus on that as part of the collection. Talks about correspondence and other things. So that's an indication of what we're looking at as part of this individual's life in this collection. So these, just a little more description on the elements of your finding aid. So the title again, unique ID, your accession number. Dates, there are a lot of options for. You can do the span and then include a caveat for bulk dates. You can have something where I've done before with a slash mark, like a forward slash, if you have a large gap in time, say individual had in their possession correspondence of their family members from 1 or 2 generations before, and then their own material that they created. And so you want to reflect that in the finding aid dates and include those earlier materials, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have something from every year in between. So on this example of bulk dates, 77 to 2001, so your earliest document 77, your latest is 2021, but the bulk of the material comes from the years 95 to 2001. So this will help your researcher if what they're looking for is, say, during this person's early part of their life or career, which is outside of those bulk dates, then they may know, okay, I want to look at this finding aid still, but I may not be as interested, or I may not need to pore over it. It could possibly not have what I'm looking for. The creating entity, the bio and history, and the scope and content note. And so here I've given an example of what I was saying before. So the papers of George Shirk include records from his term as director of the Historical Society, but not mayor of the city. And so this is a good example for someone who was looking at George Shirk's papers and hoping to find something for the time that they were mayor. You could easily then say this collection's not going to have what I need. Access restrictions for copyright use and other things, and then your container list. So here's an example of those elements. And in this example, you'll see that each layer has a different description of this material. So the collection overall includes the years 1909 to 1997. But then you'll see series 2 is only 1921 to 69 with those bulk dates of 25 to 39. So you've gotten even more specific at the series level. So within that series 2, the third box is general correspondence, which includes the dates 21 to 36. And then here's 3 of the items within that box. So in folder 1, description, it does not repeat that it's general correspondence. It does not repeat that it's business and correspondence documents. It does not repeat that it's M 2011-216, or that it's the Hardin collection. So in each of your levels, as you're describing, you don't want to have to repeat that same information. You want to be sure that you're being more and more specific as you get down to the folder or the item description. So do you all have questions at this point about finding aids or things specifically that I've talked about? While you're making your description, important to stick to the facts and remain objective. I've given an example here about saying someone is the best or someone is the most famous or the worst or most terrible. These are opinions based on a unique perspective, which is not our role as archivists. Our role is to remain objective and to represent the materials for what it is in the context of history and not the context of our lives as individuals. So we all bring with us an inherent bias based on our perspective and our lives and the things that we know and have seen. And those are all valid for you as an individual, but not for your work on the finding aids. So it's important to then remember to only state the facts as you know them. And if you are not sure, do not ever assume, because you're not sure. And so you always want to err on the side of omission. So if you cannot absolutely prove that something is true, then just leave it out. You don't need to mention it. Maybe I can't think of a good example, but there's always going to be, it will always get called up somehow if there's a statement that's not really factual. It could get you into a position where someone's expecting material that's not there, or there's a lot of different problems that can cause for the description of the materials. But the most important thing, which is part of the archival code of ethics, is to be objective and not pass judgment upon the materials as you describe them. So I feel like my slides got a little out of order and I'm gonna have to apologize. I was looking for this one earlier when I was giving that other description, and here it is. So the way I was describing those boxes and folders is what I like to call the top-down description, where you don't repeat what's happening. So you do the largest and broadest at the top, and then you get more specific as it goes down to the item. So again, you're not having to repeat anything that you've said before. Sorry about that. So going along with being objective, I have a couple slides that are really text heavy, but I found this really great guide online, which is from the Harvard Center of the History of Medicine. And there's been a lot of work done recently in the archival community about conscientious and inclusive description. And this can be on legacy collections, things that you might want to revisit or redo the description for. And this is also something you can use for collection description going forward. It's very important to, again, avoid interpretation and speculation. Things you want to say, this is what we know for sure, and state it in the most unambiguous language possible. So this was also something I thought that was important to bring up, is language. Sometimes you're going to run across an example like this one where it uses a term that is no longer in common usage. And that could be because it's offensive, or it's racist, or it's a slur, or there's any number of things that have made that change in our language where it's just no longer used. And so it's okay to stick with that original title because that's what your material is, but you can go ahead and put in there references to the current name or changes that have been made since then, so people will know when they're reading it that that's the institution that you're referring to. So again, there's been a lot of work done on this lately. There's a lot of really great groups out there working on it. The National Archives has a task force right now that's in the news for changing some descriptions of material that could be offensive or that is really offensive. And the way it was described originally is now being updated. And so they're changing those things to be more respectful and make it so it can be understood in the context of history, but not be offensive to people. So these are just some articles that you can look at that discuss different ways of approaching description in an inclusive way. So I just kind of threw some questions out. We have a couple more minutes. If you guys want to ask questions, I'd be excited to hear them. Or I can just kind of talk about these ones that I've put up here.
There was one in the chat that says examples of when you would actually describe something at the item level. Do you have any concrete examples about that?
So something that you'd want to describe on the item level is probably there'll be items that are unique enough that you cannot describe it at the folder level. If you gave a general description and said, you know, here's a group of photographs from 1934 in Oklahoma City. Well, that's not really going to help anyone know if they need to look into that folder specifically or not. I think photographs are a good example of items that really have to be described individually in order to be most useful if they're not scanned, you know, if you're not looking at an image of it. You know, digital collections, things that are born digital, electronic files are most likely going to need an individual description unless it's something that can be grouped, like, you know, purchase orders from a month and a year. So if there are shared elements that are descriptive enough to make that group identifiable as a group, then folder box descriptions, I think, would be sufficient. But when it requires more specific information, do you have a better example, JJ or Nicole? Nicole, I think you're muted.
I'll let Nicole go first.
I would probably include an example of like the letters between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, particularly because they are so heavily researched. Researchers are looking for specific things in correspondence. So it probably is very beneficial to have a folder of correspondence all the way down to the item level in that regard.
Right. And I think that's a great example of what I was saying about the collection telling you how it needs to be described, where you wouldn't do that for every single collection you have of correspondence, but because of these notable individuals, that would cause you to want to do that.
That was going to be my example too, notable individuals. I once did a congressman who was on a committee for communications and communicated with a lot of Hollywood bigwigs. And so we just pulled out those names because those could be research points of interest.
That's a great question. Thank you.
But overall, I'd say 95% of the time, you're probably never gonna go down to the item level.
Yeah, you hope not, because you want to finish. You want to finish processing your collection. If you decide at the beginning to go item by item, you better not have 50 million items or you're never going to get done. You know, that's the other part of being realistic and understanding when you can generalize and not. And, you know, that's when your scope note and your bio and those things can really help you give a more general folder description, is that your scope note has enough information for the researcher to read through there and know, okay, if it says business correspondence 1895, it's going to include the time that this person was traveling from St. Louis to wherever, and that's what I'm looking at. You know, they'll know their subject, and you've described it well enough to say you don't have to put in that folder description. This is from the time that they traveled from St. Louis to Chicago. That will be implied from the finding aid as a whole in your description. So this is,
I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
I was just going to provide another example. A couple of weeks ago, we had a reporter from Bloomberg here researching Alfred Drummond, who was a big oil and ranch man. I think the Flower Moon movie that's being made has generated a lot of interest around oil and ranching and whatnot. And so we do not have that collection. It's a huge collection. It is not processed down to the item level. And so, and I didn't really know what she was after. I'm like, well, what is it? Because there's, 150 cubic feet of records here. What is it exactly that you're looking for? So that's really what you want your folder headings to help you with. And she said, well, I'm trying to understand his wealth. And I'm like, okay, so what do you know so far about his wealth? And she said, well, I know he had 2 enterprises that generate a lot of money. And so she was able to give me those names. And those names are on folders. So I pulled boxes that had folders with those names on them. And she was here for a week, but found just, I'd pull the boxes and she'd go through them. And then I'd pull another set of boxes for her and she'd go through them. But that's really usually how it goes on a daily basis. Usually we don't have stuff down to the item level. So we can't say, okay, well, yes, we have a particular correspondence or we have particular ledgers or whatever, but we can point you in the right direction.
Absolutely. I think that's a really great example. It also brings up a good point to make when thinking about this is that, I did say you always have your researcher in mind, always have your patrons in mind, but you can't always know what someone's looking for or what they're going to be thinking of in the future or that sort of thing. And it's, your job, again, to just present the facts. So that's the best way you can do that. In order to, like Nicole said, get those things that are going to ping that they're looking for, business names and dates and places and names of individuals, all of those proper who, what, when, where, and why. Those are the points that are going to get people to where they need to be. And if they haven't figured it out yet, it's not your job to drive their cart up to their thesis statement. They have to get themselves there. So I think sometimes people want to over describe things because they're hoping or they're worried that it will not be discovered or not be found by someone looking at that topic. But there's a lot of work that goes into the research side of it that we don't ever see. And as soon as you think you understand as an archivist some materials, I guarantee someone will come in with a different viewpoint and just be looking at them for some reason you never ever thought of. Yep. But if your description is general enough and just has the facts, then that researcher will be able to get to that regardless of what their perspective is or where they're coming from. So we have 5 minutes. I put this up here about what about more product, less process, which I don't know if that's too old for anyone to remember. Because it was kind of a long time ago.
It was a while, wasn't it?
But it was it's a whole movement of let's not overthink everything. There are elements of MPLP that are still in practice and people are still talking about it today as far as, if the folders are in decent condition and it's a recent collection, then do you really need to refolder it? Do you really need to spend the time making new descriptions if the folders are already have headings on them and you can just rebox them and keep them in a nice environment that Holly described last week where those things are not going to be prone to deteriorate. You get it out on the shelf, you get it ready for business. That's the most important element there, is that it's not languishing in the unprocessed rows because you haven't gotten it out there. So the other thing, antiquated and offensive language found in materials. And I sort of touched on that a little bit. I know, JJ, you've had some experience with that. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but would you talk about very briefly was it oral histories you were
Yeah,
working
mine
with?
was an oral history transcription, and somebody was saying language that we don't use anymore, that racist terminology. And so we were debating, do we include that? Do we put the first letter and then asterisks out what it is because everybody knows what it is? Or how do we go about doing that? And I didn't really have a good answer for, because our institution wasn't sure how to handle it. So I actually reached out to OAA and asked what are best practices here, and got the Baylor, I think the Baylor Guide to Transcription. And so which basically said use whatever language it is, and then you can parenthesize like you did in the example earlier and say this is not a term used anymore. Now that it would be this term or such and such. But with transcription, it's a little bit more tricky because it's in text. So this is where you would put it in your description. You would note it in your description that there was some offensive or outdated language contained in this transcript. So,
Yeah, and that's a good thing you could put in your descriptive note or your scope and content note about the collection, is just to say, warning, this contains explicit language.
kind of a disclaimer.
Yeah, absolutely. So these other questions, a lot of things, and like JJ was just talking about, are based on policy. And if your repository doesn't have one, then it may be up to you to look at some of those things. Couple of practical tips right here at the end. I always love to use a pencil because invariably I will have to end up erasing for something. And that kind of goes right into the second one of not to number the folders until you're ready to type everything in or make your finding aid, because you'll always have to reorganize it somehow. If you start writing those numbers early, one of them is going to show up later that you need it in the sequence. Be consistent and do your preservation rehousing while you're making your descriptions. Touch it once if you can, that's ideal, and then it will be good. And my number one tip, don't let perfect ruin good. A finished collection is 100% more valuable than one that never sees the shelf or a patron. I've added some links here, which you'll get this slides. And once again, I will plug the ARPA grant for archives, libraries, museums. And thank you to ORAB and the NHPRC for funding for the materials for this series, and the Oklahoma Archivist Association. Next week, you'll hear from Kara Newby about access and outreach. And it's 3:00. All right.
Oh, bye. Good job, Jen.
Thank you
All
all
right,
for
well-
coming so much. And again, here's my contact information. And please let us know if you have any questions.
And I'm going to hit stop on the recording.